For years, fire departments in northern Michigan have been experiencing a decline in the number of volunteer firefighters.
Departments are trying to find ways to get more volunteers for the potentially life-saving job. In this special report, 9 on 10's Cody Boyer finds out what's causing the volunteer firefighter shortage.
The firefighter is not just a firefighter. We're almost an all-emergency response type individual.
For volunteer firefighter Chris Parrish, preparation doesn't stop at putting out flames.
You can lift a car, you can spread metal open. There's a fair bit to it. There's fire calls and EMS calls, but many times they're both together, like a car accident call.
In places like Grand Traverse County, fire departments rely on volunteers as more than backup.
The volunteer firefighter is so important to our country and our community.
Theo Weber is the fire chief for the Grand Traverse Rural Fire Department, which relies solely on volunteers. But there's a nationwide problem that puts stations like his in jeopardy.
This department suffered the same problems every other department across this country in recruiting volunteers to do this job.
The problem has its roots in the mid-1980s. Since then, it's only gotten worse.
There's a lot of reasons for it, but most of it is time constraints for the volunteer, having to work a couple jobs to make a living, mom and dad both working. So we're having a steady decline.
While many fire departments, like the one here in Traverse City, are filled with career-based only firefighters, they have to start from somewhere. The training just to become a volunteer, though, it's often just as rigorous.
There's a lot of requirements even before you apply.
Traverse City Fire Chief Jim Tuller wasn't always chief.
Myself, I started out as a volunteer with Grand Traverse County years ago, which is not untypical for any of today's firefighters that seek a career in the full-time service.
His station works with career-based only personnel, but he says volunteers are just as important.
There's a lot of municipalities across our country. In fact, I would have to say that most firefighters in our nation are volunteers.
Theo says nearly 70% of our nation's firefighters are made up of volunteers. This fact has stations facing a big problem.
We can't mandate their response. If they want to volunteer to respond, they will. We can't force them to.
When career firefighters respond to calls, they rely on volunteers as reinforcement. With 175 calls each year on average, they need them when things get out of hand.
If a fire department responds to an emergency and they need some assistance from the neighboring agency, a neighboring fire department, we can provide that at a moment's notice.
Volunteers have to be trained in emergency medical care, vehicle extrication, rescues from water to high-angle rescues, and even hazardous material response.
You can cut a door, you can cut lots of stuff with them. Fire and EMS, it's almost like insurance. It's possible that you would never need it, but it's possible you would need it really badly too.
Basically, they get the same training as career firefighters.
The emergency doesn't know whether a career firefighter is responding or a volunteer. They have to be trained the same way, follow the same rules and regulations.
As a volunteer, a lot of times you get a pager, and you keep this with you, and it'll go off like that.
Then they are off with fire engines, ambulances, and other tools they need to save lives.
Most of the smaller communities rely on a volunteer service. They can't afford to pay career firefighters to be in their stations, so it's extremely important to our community to volunteer.
Many volunteers do receive a stipend to compensate them for their expenses, like gas and mileage. To Chris, though, the satisfaction comes from just doing his job.
It does feel good to, we train to help people in their greatest time of need. And there's a great satisfaction in rendering that aid to people when they need it.
In Grand Traverse County, I'm Cody Boyer, 9 on 10 News at 6.